Welcome to the Hunters Point Parks Conservancy's Chapter 2 of Hunters Point and Long Island City Through the Ages. I'm Casey Chamberlain, Director of the Hunters Point Parks Conservancy. Hope you're able to join us for Chapter 1, which was prehistory through Henry Hudson's arrival, 1609. That can be found on our YouTube channel. Look for Hunters Point Parks Conservancy. And then this is Chapter 2 of a 5-part series. We are very fortunate to be having Andrew Capuchinas as our guide, who is a local resident, member of the New York Map Society, amateur historian, and is going to be guiding us again today through 17th and 18th centuries in the American Revolution. If you want to know more about the work of the Hunters Point Parks Conservancy, you can check out our website, hunterspointparks.org, where we post all the info about our parks and our neighborhood and the events happening there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, again, our guide for today, Andrew. Take it away.
Well, thank you and welcome, everyone. Part 1 ended with Hudson's arrival in 1609 into New York Harbor, and I thought it would be interesting to see the replica of his ship, the Half Moon, approaching Lower Manhattan in about the same place, people think, 400 years later. The original replica actually was donated by the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but it burned in 1934, and this was a much more recent replica, and it was sailing into New York Harbor on an anniversary of Hudson's arrival. What Hudson actually discovered, he was looking for a way to get to India through North America. He didn't find that, but when he sailed up the Hudson, what he did find was an enormous number of beavers. And that was critical to the history of New York City and New York State, because it turned out that beaver hats were very fashionable in Europe for 300 years. And his information back to the Dutch company that sponsored him on his voyage, they were very excited because there were thousands and thousands of beavers in upstate New York, and that became a real point of profit for the Dutch company. So much so that the beavers went almost extinct within a number of decades. So the first European settlement in New York State and the first Dutch settlement in North America overall was a fur trading post right near Albany, with New York City still a planned gatekeeper to that post. The first New York City settlers, 30 French-speaking Belgians, arrived on Governor's Island in 1624. 1626, Peter Minuet had been appointed Director General of the Dutch West India Company, and his mission was to settle future New York City. He met with Native Americans at Upper Manhattan, and he thought he bought Manhattan for goods not equivalent to $24, but actually worth several $1,000s today. And there's a painting of what that meeting might have looked at. And the photograph on the right is a tulip tree in Inwood Hill Park, which is said to be the site of that very same meeting. Now, the Dutch thought they were buying Manhattan Island. The Native Americans thought that what they were granting were permission for Dutch settlers to use Manhattan. And what's interesting is even 30 years later, the Lenape still had not left Manhattan. They had no intention of selling the land and leaving the island. And a Dutch councilman in 1660 complained that the Lenape, or actually he said the savages, wouldn't leave the land that the Dutch bought. Here's the earliest known view of New Amsterdam looking east, and within that red box to the east of Manhattan Island is what appears to be Newtown Creek and the spit of land that might be today's Hunters Point. 1628, the Dutch were very interested in getting more people to come and settle in the New York City area. So there were grants or patents of land that they gave to patroons or very wealthy Dutchmen who were willing to establish farms in the area and bring immigrants to the area within 3 years. And you'll see on this map that peninsula of land to the right of what would be called Roosevelt Island. That's Hallett's Point, and that will figure in one of our later slides. 1635, a fellow named Jacques Benton got a grant of 160 acres along today's Astoria. He convinced a few tenants to clear and cultivate, but he fled back to Manhattan a number of years later when Native Americans destroyed what Benton had built. New York City on its own became, and especially within Manhattan, became extremely dependent on the labor of slaves, more so than any other colony in New Amsterdam or along the eastern seaboard. And in fact, by 1640, it said that 20% of the city was of African descent. The way that the Dutch dealt with enslaved people was very different from the way that English colonists dealt with slaves. They were allowed to learn, be baptized, get married in the Dutch Reformed Church, and in some cases, they even allowed enslaved people to earn wages and own property. And in fact, about 20% of all enslaved people in New Amsterdam were free by the time that New Amsterdam was taken over by the English. In 1642, the Dutch granted the Reverend Francis Doty a patent for 13,000 acres at Mespat. That's nearly all of Newtown, Maspeth, and part of Flushing River. And you see that it's directly to the east of the area of Long Island City. And they were Dotyites, a Puritan sect seeking refuge from the Puritans in New England who, even though they came to New England to seek religious freedom, they didn't offer it to anyone else. In 1643, south of Benton's Grant and south of what is today's Ravenswood area, Francis Finn in 1651 got a patent on land that was basically meadow and salt marsh that flooded every tide. And the junction of Jackson and Vernon was just an island at that time, surrounded by almost permanent water. The first Dutch Reformed minister of New Amsterdam got 130 acres along Newtown Creek, which was known later as Dominie's Hook. Peter Praed bought the land, willed it to his daughter's children. One of his children, Jacob Bennett, left the area to his daughter, Anna, who married Captain George Hunter, which is where the name Hunters Point comes from.
Wow. Can we go back to that 1 second? Looking at that previous, where it says Blackwell Island, that's Roosevelt Island that we're looking at there?
That was the original name of Roosevelt Island, yes.
Wow, okay. Yeah, it's interesting looking at the way these maps change through the years, even the drawings of them are not exactly accurate, a little changing, a little amorphous in some ways. That's 1776. Okay.
What's also clear from this map is how few roads there were.
Yeah.
Western Queens, there's basically one road, which I believe is today's Northern Boulevard, which actually was named Jackson Avenue, going right to the shores of the East River. And you'll see that that road became a critical piece of the activities of the British during the American Revolution.
Yeah.
So 1652, the land that Benton abandoned, and his land went east towards today's 29th Street. It was granted to a guy named William Hallett. And I'm showing you a contemporary Google map with the red point being Hallett's Point. And that is, you'll see that depicted also on the map on the left from 1778, Hallett's Cove. He abandoned it also because of Native American hostilities. Again, the Native Americans, they wanted to preserve their rights to use the land. And when they saw that development was starting to look permanent, they destroyed it. Hallett came back in 1664 and purchased even more land. And the land, that whole area was in Hallett family hands right until 1905.
Another question you may or may not know the answer to on that image, if you notice, I'm just noticing sort of the different shape and geography of the point in the 1778 map versus the current map where it's very much rounded. Is that just maybe a map error, or does the land actually kind of changed that much, maybe through development or through erosion or something?
It has to do with the way that the source material for maps of that era. That was a map by Thomas Kitchen, who lived in Great Britain and I don't think ever left. And as sailors came back from voyages to the New World, they would go to places where maps were being created, and they would share their information about what they saw. So it was basically hearsay. There was nobody in 1778 who was surveying Hallett's Point and Hallett's Cove. It was pretty much hearsay by sailors being interpreted and illustrated by map makers who never set foot in the area.
Well, yeah, I guess that does explain all the different shapes of the area, particularly a very difficult area to map with all the different inlets and jut outs and stuff. So that definitely explains it.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of incentive to be more accurate because there were no settlements to speak of. At the junction of that Hallett's Cove, you'll see there are like 4 or 5 buildings, and that basically was it in that area. The maps of southern Manhattan were much more accurate because there was a lot of development there. There were houses, there were shops, there were businesses being run. In Hallett's Cove, we're talking a couple of farms. In 1664, a number of British ships arrived at New Amsterdam, intending just to take over the entire area. And they promised immediately to let the settlers keep the commercial rights that they already had. So this painting illustrates New York City residents pleading with Peter Stuyvesant not to fire that cannon at the British ships. And he relented. He was going to defend it for the Dutch, but he relented, allowed the British to take it over, but the Dutch recaptured it less than 10 years later. But the weird thing about this is that they ceded it back to the English in 1674. And why? They traded it for Suriname on the northeast coast of South America, just north of Brazil on the Atlantic coast, because they thought that Suriname was the prospects for it being profitable and a major trading center. At that time, the Dutch thought that was where they needed to invest, not in New Amsterdam. There's still a Dutch presence in Queens. The prettiest one is the Van der Ende Onderdonk House on Flushing Avenue in Ridgewood, which is just on the border of Queens and Brooklyn. And a house has been at that site since 1660. The current house, as you see there, was started being built in 1709. It's a beautiful museum. And you'll see another familiar name, Adrian Donderdonk marrying Anne Wyckoff. 1683, Queens was established as one of the original 12 counties of New York State, which was called a province at the time, an English province. And you'll see that the Bronx is not included because it was part of Westchester. And Queens was named for the Portuguese Queen Catherine, the wife of the then English King Charles II. And right up until 1899, the county of Queens was included in what is now Nassau County. Around 1698, Captain Kidd, a Scotsman, a sailor who settled in New York City after it became anglicized in 1664, was sailing north from the Caribbean, where he had been on the run from the British Crown, accused of murder and piracy. His ship was filled with treasure, and he was going back to New York City, the home of the sponsors of his earlier voyages, hoping to convince them to eliminate those charges against him. But he wasn't sure of what the end result would be. So along the way around Long Island, he deposited parts of the treasure from his ship. And it's part mythology, part reality. Maybe the mythology that some of it was buried on the banks of Newtown Creek is more myth than reality. But on Gardiner's Island, they have found silver that they attribute to Captain Kidd's treasure.
So they didn't find any in Newtown Creek then?
Not yet.
We'll keep digging.
Not yet. I'm sure that as they begin dredging, maybe other than black mayonnaise on the bottom, they'll come up with some remnants of treasure chests, silver and gold.
Well, that's another thing to look forward to with this super fun cleanup then, huh?
Absolutely. And maybe someday there'll be a TV show on the order of The Treasure of Oak Island. Cable networks on people digging on the shores of Newtown Creek.
Let's hope.
From 1700 to 1753, there wasn't any development to speak of in Western Queens. You see Newtown Creek being depicted, and the only towns depicted are Newtown and Bushwick. And Newtown, founded in 1652 by New England Puritans, had 1,000 settlers by 1700. So that was the biggest city in the area. And the rest of it was really still farmland. At the time of the Revolution, there were still just 10 farms in future Long Island City. There were no battles during the Revolutionary War in Long Island City. And in August 1776, after the Patriots were beaten in the Battle of Long Island, which occurred in Brooklyn, the British set up encampments in Queens, and we think on the eastern edge of Long Island City, and you'll see the bivouacs there. And they also maintained a fleet of ships in Newtown Creek. British and Hessian mercenaries were quartered along Skillman Avenue in today's Long Island City. And you see again, the only city of note is Newtown. In order to control movement over the very few roads, they secured what was called a narrow passage. And it's at the junction of today's Northern Boulevard, Woodside Avenue, Newtown Avenue, which I've marked on the map in red. And to provide quarters for the people guarding that area, huts were constructed east of the Dutch Kills in modern day Sunnyside. So that's it for the history of Long Island City, the 17th and the 18th centuries through the American Revolution and the end. And I hope that you'll join us next time for the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution in Long Island City. Thank you.
Fascinating. I didn't realize that there was such a long period of non-development in the area. I knew that it was farmland for a while, but I didn't kind of realize the extent of that. So that's very interesting to see. What can you give us a little taste of what we might expect in chapter 3 and sort of some maybe big picture highlights of what we're going to see coming up?
It's a very interesting series of developments, and it starts oddly enough with the fact that Newtown Creek became a place where New York City's wealthy built mansions.
Wow.
John Jacob Astor, at one point the wealthiest man in America, built a beautiful mansion on the shores of Newtown Creek, a little hard to believe. And then towards the middle of the 19th century and the start of the Industrial Revolution, having a lot to do with displacement of whale oil for lighting and for heat into petroleum, Newtown Creek and the area around Long Island City, the southern part certainly, exploded with commercial development. And Newtown Creek became, for its size, the busiest commercial waterway in America, far exceeding the Mississippi River at the same time.
Wow. And it's actually, still one of the busiest today, despite what people might not think that, because there's still a lot of active industry on the creek. That's no mansions though, as far as I'm aware. I don't envision Jeff Bezos coming down and building a mansion next to the sewage treatment plant on Newtown Creek. But
oh no, he wanted it further up in the Annabelle Basin, right?
Yes, yeah, almost. He was close. Well, thanks, Andrew. Again, we learned so much from these. Appreciate all your time and the research that goes into these pieces. So yeah, we look forward to chapter 3, which we'll be putting out soon. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us, info@hunterspointparks.org, and we'll try to answer them for you. And again, any more information on current day happenings in the park and in the neighborhood, check us out at hunterspointparks.org. Thanks for watching.